Yeah, so my biggest fear with all of this is that I'll start the podcast, I'll do a whole thing, and then I just don't press record.
Very Freudian, right?
No, it could happen, man. I just you just saw it. I almost didn't press the record button on the speaker there. So okay, so I just have to do a few maintenance things, then we will go ahead and get started. So, all right, so upcoming episodes, Mr. Deshaun Boatwright. I'll be traveling to Richmond, Virginia in hopefully in a month, maybe more, maybe less. He's a former MMA fighter. I've known him since middle of high school. He's one of the funniest guys I've ever met in my life, but he's also one of the nicest guys. And he is frequently posting videos of him training kids, adults in Richmond. I don't know if he's training them to be fighters, but they're definitely getting more healthy. So I want to talk to him and see what he's been up to since I knew him back in school. Dr. Donald Brown. He will also hopefully be next month. Just a legit guy, just a kind human being, and he'll be talking about mental health and the U.S. justice system. And then after that, these are unconfirmed, but I'm trying to get this hair restoration guy to come in and talk to me. Oh, it's important. I think it's important.
It is a major industry for sure. Right?
Yeah, me being in my 30s, it's even more important now. So
you look pretty good. You get.
Thank you.
I could use a little.
Well, hey, if he comes in and talks to me, we'll exchange information. All right, so yeah, that'll be that. But he'll also be talking about women, because sometimes they need, some touch-ups too. So, and then I'm also trying to lock down a guest that'll be talking about sex trafficking. So I got a lot of things coming down the pipeline. Also to the people, I have not forgotten about you in India, Cambodia, Ireland, the Philippines, and Canada. These are people that were listening in my first 3 episodes, and then because I moved from Baltimore to Los Angeles, and I was off for 3 months, and I have not seen these people listening since. So I lost these guests, and I'm trying to reconnect. So if any of these people in these areas of the world are watching or listening to this, I would love to hear from you. I haven't given up just yet. And lastly, so the topic for today will be marijuana. Okay, so for the weed enthusiasts, the anti-weed people, for the people that are on the fence about marijuana, for the people that don't care, you are all welcome to today's conversation. Okay, if you feel yourself getting angry, upset, or irritable about anything being said today, hit the pause button. Hit the pause button, take a walk, come back in 5 minutes, take a few deep breaths. Come on back, ride this train with us. We're just talking. We're just talking. Relax. So your experience with weed may not be what our patients have experienced with weed, and it might not be representative of the general population. So I can assure you that everything that we will discuss today will be from our professional, anecdotal, and scientific perspective. Okay, we're just talking. Relax. All right, relax. It's okay. All right. Do you have anything you want to add to that last bit that I?
No, I'm very relaxed in this studio of yours. It's just beautiful lighting. Temperature's perfect.
Glad you like it.
Great. I love the fanboy stuff. It's really great.
Oh man, that warms my heart. All right. So you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. All right, so I am here with Dr. Timothy Fong. You graduated from Northwestern University for undergrad and for medical school, correct?
I did.
Okay. You did your psych residency at UCLA. You did your addiction fellowship at UCLA also.
That's right.
In fact, you were the first fellow.
I was the first accredited fellow back in 2002, yes.
Oh, crap. I forgot to tell you. Okay, so the mic. Bring the mic. Close to just close to your face, and you can move it around as you see fit.
This is good. Yeah.
You got options. All right, just keep it close to your face. That way, people will be able to hear you. You are co-director of the UCLA Gambling Studies program.
That's right.
You are director of the UCLA Addiction Fellowship. Is that correct?
Correct.
And you are also a part of the UCLA Cannabis Research Initiative.
That's absolutely true.
Okay. Everything I've said is factual.
Guilty as charged, yes.
Anything you'd like to add? Did I miss anything?
No, I mean, people ask, well, what do you do? I'm like, well, I say first and foremost, I'm a addiction psychiatrist. I'm a doctor that specializes in understanding and treating the causes of addictions. And they say, well, what kind of addiction? I say all kinds: substances, behavioral, chemical, you name it, natural. But at the end of the day, I'm just about trying to help people get their lives better.
Yeah.
Finding solutions to very challenging questions. Why do people get addicted? What can we do to help them? How do we prevent them? How do we help them in recovery? So that's what it's all about.
Yeah. Yeah. So speaking on the different types of addictions, when I met you, we just talked about this earlier. You did a presentation on gambling and marijuana. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. So you also dip into gambling and well, any other type of addiction.
Absolutely. And that's how I got started back in 2005, was really studying gambling addiction here in California.
Mm-hmm.
And we go back to 15 years ago, and what we were seeing is rapid expansion of gambling in California, tribal casinos, internet gambling, the poker boom, sports betting. So gambling was really everywhere. But we weren't seeing a lot of gambling addiction in the hospitals or the clinics. But that led me, as a resident of California, to say, well, where are these men and women? It's an addictive behavior, but they're not showing up to the clinic or the emergency rooms. And lo and behold, we found them, and they're there. And people are suffering from this condition of gambling disorder, and that led us to create a statewide gambling program back in 2009 to really provide no-cost treatment to anyone in California who's suffering from a gambling addiction, as well as anyone affected by someone else's gambling addiction. But that was 2009, and then as the years have progressed, what's happened in California? 2016, cannabis, marijuana legalized. January 2018, that was when the first dispensary opened in California for recreational use. Where my story came to that, I was thinking, gosh, we have gambling, we have treatment for gambling addiction, but in January 2018, we did not have really good treatments for cannabis addiction or marijuana addiction. And lo and behold, here we are opening up a state to legalize this. How are we going to minimize its damage? How are we going to maximize how to use it properly for society? And that's kind of how I got into that world of cannabis. It's weird. People say, wait a minute, you made your mark doing gambling work. What does gambling have to do with marijuana? What does gambling have to do with cannabis? They're not hand in hand like gambling and alcohol or gambling and tobacco or even gambling and sex seem to run hand in hand. But that's when we met. I was doing a presentation. It was called probably Gambling and Cannabis, What's Lying in the Weeds. Right. What's lying in the weeds.
And I did have that reaction. I said, what?
Right. So what do you remember about that presentation? What was your takeaway?
Well, it lines with one of my first questions for you. It's just the first thing that you brought up was why you use the term cannabis versus marijuana.
Right.
And I think you went through not a whole story. I mean, you kept it brief because it's obviously a presentation, but you went into why it's gotten that term.
Yeah.
Why is it called?
Well, here's the story. It's a whole thing. When I was in high school, and I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, we didn't have cannabis. We barely had marijuana. And it was with alcohol. We had tobacco, but it was kind of hard to get marijuana. And then I went to college in Northwestern. Started to hear more about this, and people, hey, you want a little weed? You want a little pot? You want a little marijuana?
Not to date you, but what year? What time was this?
I graduated high school in 1990.
Okay.
And college in 94. So, okay. I mean, it was there, but I didn't really hear much about it. I didn't think much about it.
Right.
But I did think of it classically. If you use pot, you must be a, quote, stoner. Long hair, Frampton Records, don't shave, don't really do much with your life. So
grungy.
Grungy. That's what I grew up with, and that's so important because when I started to do academic work in marijuana and cannabis research, I didn't appreciate where the word marijuana came from. Mm-hmm. And number one, it's not a scientific term. So cannabis is the scientific term for the plant. And cannabis sativa, cannabis indica, these are all the different strains of the plant based on botanical names. Marijuana is a cultural term.
Okay.
The term predominantly used by Mexican Americans and Latino culture or Latinx cultures to just describe the cannabis plant.
Mm-hmm.
But why it's steeped in so much history is that it's the Marijuana Prohibition Act, 1914, 1918, that was used by our federal government at the time to essentially put a prohibition on a plant.
This goes back over 100 years ago.
Over 100 years. That really didn't have that much damage to public health. So it's the same story across all the other drugs of abuse. Here was a plant, a naturally derived plant that was used by minority culture, part of family celebration, birthday, quinceañeras, whatever. It didn't really cause damage like in the way of deaths and overdoses if you think about. And then here's a federal government saying, hey, we're concerned about this usage. We're concerned that this plant is causing more of a public health issue than we actually have data on. And then you see the history of it, things like Reefer Madness, movies that depict people who use marijuana and becoming crazed and sexually aggressive and criminal behavior.
There's a movie?
Yeah, it's a movie called Reefer Madness. It's one of the first kind of propaganda movies about marijuana. Again, all highlighting that marijuana was associated with minority groups, Mexican Americans, immigrants, lowbrow folks, people associated with crime. And I never appreciated that degree of racism and discrimination against and stereotype of people who use marijuana until I really started studying that.
Okay.
If you look at the DSM-5, our handbook, our psychiatric handbook, marijuana does not show up anywhere. It's cannabis. So the proper term that we've come to realize is that I study cannabis, or we study the effects of cannabis on body, brain, and mind. And that the term marijuana is just, again, cultural and steeped with all hundreds of years of tradition of discrimination and racism. And frankly, it's incorrect. So, and it brings up and evokes just the term marijuana, all these false images. And I think that's the key. Because when I first heard this, hey, don't use the word marijuana, I'm like, why not? And I thought about it in my own life, because when I think of the word marijuana, I think of those kids dropping out of high school.
Well, you also thought of them that way too.
I thought of them that way as well, stereotype, and that absolutely, not only just poor science, but it's just dangerous to perpetuate stereotypes. So that's why I've really gone away from using marijuana. But you see, in languages and state bills throughout, you still see a lot of the term marijuana in bills and legislative things, so that we still have a long way to go to kind of sharpen up our vocabulary around this.
Yeah, so you mentioned cannabis is a plant, right? I think we have a feeling for what certain drugs are, right? With weed, I call it weed. I'll use cannabis I'll do my best to use cannabis from now on. I have sort of a feel of what it is, of what it looks like. But looking at it more in depth with what it actually is, it's a plant, right? But what does it actually do in the human body? What is cannabis?
Well, and that's a whole career in of itself. But here's the thing about all the substances that are out there that we can enjoy. Alcohol, it's a plant. Cocaine, it's a plant. Tobacco, it's a plant.
Right.
Opiates, it's a plant. Cannabis, it's a plant. Sugar, it's a plant. So cannabis, from just a pure botanical description, is just simply a plant. And there's a wide variety of different plants. Now, I'm not a botanist, but well over 40, 50, 60 different kind of species of the cannabis class of plant. And to actually determine, is this plant cannabis versus something else, that's going to be botanical definitions based on seeds and growth and patterns of its leaf and, the products it spills out. There's male cannabis plants, there's female cannabis plants, there's, again, a wide variety. And hey, you and I went to medical school. We didn't get that lecture on botany.
No, we wouldn't.
But it's fascinating. And a lot of this, to be honest, I went to a place called the Museum of Weed that was here in California last year. It was a pop-up museum tracing the history of the cannabis plant in America, and it showed a lot of these botanical history to it. But the long and short of it is the cannabis plant has inside it well over 100 different kind of chemicals that were called cannabinoids.
Okay.
These chemicals, cannabinoids, when they get inside our body, affect all sorts of things in our body, brain, and mind. And our body in itself, we generate our own natural version of cannabinoids. So our body and our certain cells in our bodies, just like it spits out dopamine or serotonin.
So we have cannabinoids.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, okay. Our body generates this chemical called endocannabinoids. but we can also ingest it that's produced externally by these plants. And that's the part, is that there's 100 different kinds of plant-derived cannabinoids that have a variety of different effects on our body. The number one, if this were like Billboard Top 100, what is the number one cannabinoid compound in ever? It's THC. It's the one that, of course, is psychoactive. It gets to the brain. It's the one that everyone knows about. It's the one that has a wide variety of effects. The number two ranked, pound for pound, if you want to use combat language, would probably be CBD, cannabidiol. And that's gotten so much attention in the last 10 years as a non-psychoactive cannabinoid that could help with pain, anxiety, sleep, general sense of wellness. But again, there's 100 of these different characters.
So those big two, THC and CBD, they're all working in the body, but just in different places.
Different places.
Different areas of the brain, which I imagine is why sometimes when people smoke, they also feel that, they increase their appetite.
That's right.
It's just a different area of the brain where appetite happens to be.
That's right.
Happens to be regulated.
Yeah, and even more specifically, cannabinoid receptors, like the parking lot, if you will. The receptors are everywhere in the brain, not just one part of the brain, everywhere. Learning, memory, mood, sleep, appetite, vision, hearing. And then in the body itself, pain receptors throughout the body, gut receptors that control whether you poo or you don't poo. So, I mean, it's everywhere. And that's why the cannabis industry, and I shouldn't say industry, the people who love cannabis, who swear by it, say, here's a natural product that when I take it makes my life better today and tomorrow. And I think that's why when we get to it later, it's just so fascinating, because never has there been a plant that's created so much intense response to it, emotionally, politically, historically, economically.
Yeah, absolutely.
And yet there's so much mystery about it. So you're a big sci-fi fan, and I am as well. And one of my favorite, and not a lot of people will get this analogy, but one of my favorite shows in the 1980s was a show called The Greatest American Hero. And it was a show about a teacher who fell into a superhero costume that he got from aliens. And it came with an instruction manual on how to use this,
this is intense
costume. And in the pilot episode, he loses the instruction manual. So he has to figure out the course of the show when he puts on the suit, how to fly, how to use its powers, how to use the X-ray vision, how to use the super hearing. And he just has to figure it out. And I feel like cannabis is like that. Is that we have this incredible plant that has all these powers inside it. We don't quite yet know how to use it.
Still trying to figure that out.
Still trying to figure out, what dose, how to take it, how long to take it. When is too much too much? When is too little too little? Should it be regulated with more scrutiny, or should we let anyone just walk into
a dispensary
and buy it and away they go? So a lot of really fascinating questions, which is why I got into it, because to be honest, 10 years ago, 2010, I wasn't thinking about cannabis. I wasn't thinking about going into this field. We were building our gambling program. The opioid crisis were just then starting to get into full effect. That's where our time was being spent.
The opioid crisis.
Yeah, back in 2010, we were starting to see more of that. And of course, here in California, methamphetamine never went away, so we were seeing a lot of those patients. But no one ever thought that we would be doing this work with cannabis just even 10 years ago. So I'm really excited to kind of lay out some of our vision of what we think are important studies and what we're really seeing in the hospital and in the office setting.
Well, I think that's important. The information you mentioned about the it's going to be hard for me to say the receptors. Cannabinoid? Is that right? Okay. The cannabinoid receptors. I think that's hard for people to understand because, again, I think we all have a very surface level understanding about drugs and medication.
Yeah.
We just call them stimulants,
Yeah.
But if you really take a step back and look at stimulants, you're just hijacking systems that are already in the body.
That's right.
You're increasing dopamine, serotonin. It's already there in place. We're just hijacking
That's
it.
right.
And one of the differences between why one drug is more dangerous than another one of the biggest differences is how we use it. Are we using it responsibly?
Right.
Opiates are, I think, for anyone who breaks their leg, are fantastic. But if you use them for too long or at too higher dosages, you develop an addiction, which
Absolutely.
is what the opiate crisis. You could say the same thing for alcohol. It can be fun on a Friday night at happy hour.
Right.
But if you use it too much, for an extended period of time, it could, ruin your life.
It's always interesting to me. People say, I get this a lot, like, why shouldn't drugs be legal? And I always come back and say, well, why are alcohol and tobacco legal? Mm-hmm. What purposes do they serve for survival? There's no nutritional value in alcohol. There's no nutritional value in tobacco. And 500,000 Americans die every year from tobacco-related causes. About 100,000 die every year from alcohol-related causes. Mm-hmm. And yet there's very little, if ever, any call to get rid of these products from the face of the earth. It's real fascinating because I think cannabis is, again, hundreds of years behind that same story, because I always say to folks, things that should be illegal are things that are so dangerous that any person, even who's trying to use it responsibly, could end up dead, mm-hmm. or it serves no value or purpose to our society moving forward.
I'd agree with that.
Yeah. So tobacco and alcohol, if you think about it, in moderation, do they improve the quality of our lives? Absolutely. Mm-hmm. But they're also a huge economic backbone of our society. Right. So if you were suddenly get rid of all those things, then you'd have millions of people unable to sustain themselves. But I think about larger world issues, and you do as well here: food, clothing, and water. Mm-hmm. And when it gets to things like these substances, what are the implications of us spending all that time, energy, and money in growing substances like alcohol, tobacco, and cannabis that don't lead to handling things like hunger or thirst?
Right.
So that's pretty metaphysical and all that. But at the end of the day, people say, do you think cannabis should be legalized? I say, absolutely, I do.
I agree.
I say absolutely it should be, but it needs to be regulated properly, mm-hmm. like tobacco and alcohol. And we need to do a much better job of explaining what the scientific facts are about it and demystifying what it's not. It's not a panacea. It's not the greatest thing since sliced bread. For some people, it can make their lives incredibly valuable. And one of the things I do is work in sports psychiatry. So we work with a lot of athletes, both professional and elite and amateur. And the question I always ask a lot of the athletes is, do you believe cannabis is performance enhancing? Some athletes are like, no way. It's just alcohol. It just takes the edge off. Others have looked me straight in the eye and said, oh, absolutely.
I feel better.
Absolutely.
I can concentrate.
It allows me to train. It allows me to focus. It allows me to recover. It allows me to deal with pain. And yeah, that's an edge over the next person. Mm-hmm. So very interesting question. I think what's been incredible, I think back to 2010, I didn't even set foot inside a dispensary because there wasn't one. There was just medical cannabis dispensaries in LA. Now, from where we are and sitting in your studios, we could deliver. We can, while we're talking, we could right now order up cannabis and have it delivered to your home,
California,
in probably the next 30 minutes.
Yeah.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
Compared to what that was 20 years ago when I was walking around high school and everyone's like, what's that? What do you have in there? Where'd you get it? And, oh, I got it from a friend of a friend of a friend. And that was only 20 years ago. And imagine where we're going to be in 20 years from now.
Yeah.
In terms of what kind of cannabis is available to the average person.
Yeah. The interesting thing about the debate against and for legalization of cannabis is, obviously this is why I started off the show the way that I did, just speaking to both people that are advocates for, people that are advocates against. Mm-hmm. I'm also the type of person who believes that, it should be regulated. I'm not against it being legal. There's multiple reasons why it should be legalized, but I think it should be legalized. The argument for it being legalized without regulation is sometimes, this is what I hear.
Yeah.
I think I just heard this on TV just yesterday. Marijuana is less, cannabis.
There you go.
It's less harmful. I'm working on it. It's less harmful than alcohol. It's less harmful than cigarettes. And I can't disagree with that, but I think, I actually think back to when Prohibition was lifted, and I'm for Prohibition being lifted. I just think that they could have done it better.
Right.
If you've ever been to a party with someone or a group of friends, there's always that one person who has no idea how to drink.
That's right.
They get hammered on Friday, and then the next week they get hammered again. It's just like, did no one teach you what you're doing? Like there are ways to do this appropriately.
That's right.
Now, fair enough. I think people, regardless of whether or not you teach them how to use alcohol responsibly, they're still going to do what they do. But at the same time, I think it's mitigation of risk.
Yeah.
That's what it's about for me. It's mitigation of risk.
And again, thinking about when I grew up, I remember, health class, it was always, here are the drugs and what they do. But there wasn't a discussion of how do you know when it's too much?
Right.
Is it appropriate to even try? And I grew up in the 80s where it was just say no. So the themes were...
That was effective.
Right. Just say no. Don't even go there. So it was like going against everything about human nature that we want to celebrate, which is risk-taking.
Yeah.
Trying something new, being curious. That's all good stuff. But when you get curious and use a potential, an quote, illegal drug that's not regulated that could kill you, that's enormous. I mean, Len Bias's death in 1986 had an effect on me. I was 14.
For anyone, Len Bias is a basketball player. What team did he play for?
Played for the University of Maryland.
University of Maryland. Okay.
He was a first-round draft pick for the Boston Celtics, 1986.
An amazing talent.
Right. And this is a time when crack cocaine was rising in America, but it was unknown to the mainstream public. He died on draft night after partying, after being selected number 2, I think, by the Boston Celtics, and his death. And his death sparked essentially a war on drugs in the United States. His death sparked national discussion about what is crack cocaine, and we need to get rid of it. And unfortunately, created a generation of harsh penalties that were unjustified. But I remember its impact on me as a 14-year-old, thinking, what is crack cocaine? Where do I try it? I'm curious. Why did he die? What's going on? And those questions never really got answered when I was in high school, other than just discussions with my peers.
Right.
And you can imagine how kids trying to teach kids, that didn't go over very well. So I hear you loud and clear. And I think part of our hope is that we do more with cannabis education in elementary schools, in junior high, in high school, in colleges, and you name it. But look, at UCLA where we work, our biggest problem on campus with substances isn't cannabis. It's still alcohol, far and away.
Absolutely.
Far and away. And it's amazing that we still don't have enough alcohol prevention and early intervention programs on campuses at colleges, but we're getting there. But when it comes to cannabis, again, there's still absolutely huge risk. So people say to me, well, what does good regulation look like?
That's a good question.
Well, good regulation is based on science-based work. So the term I look is science-based legislation, science-based regulation, science-based treatment, science-based prevention. And it isn't just randomly throwing stuff out there because that sounds right or we think that works. You mentioned earlier, Just Say No is a perfect example. That is a major national initiative that eventually was a prevention campaign. But when you evaluate it, it didn't work at all in terms of changing attitudes, changing risk-taking behaviors, getting people to be more thoughtful in terms of their first usage of drugs or alcohol. It drove instead higher levels of stigma. It just said, don't use it, and if you do, you're no good. Just say no, meaning even if you have an addiction, you should have the willpower to just stop.
Right.
And I think that's an example where when you don't have science-based messages, you actually do create more harm than good. So some of the things I've been seeing around, like what are, when you drive around LA, you don't see any of those science-based messages for cannabis just yet. What do you see? You see a lot of billboards saying, stop right here.
Come on in.
Delivery service, buy 2, get a 3rd one free.
Right.
You don't see that. And you don't see, just an example, when you walk inside a dispensary, one of the concerns I have is the person behind the shelf. They're called bud tenders. That bud tender does not go through any sort of official training at all. If I go to a bar, or you and I go to a bar, non-pandemic, we know that bartender has to have training to have a bartender's license. Forget about the institute, the place. The person serving us alcohol has to have a license. The person cutting my hair, doing my nails, giving me a massage, they all have to be licensed. But as of right now, in 2020, the person selling me cannabis in a legal, regulated cannabis dispensary in California does not have to have any training whatsoever in cannabis science.
Yeah.
So that's an example of regulation that I think can be improved on.
Well, again, this goes back to what I was saying earlier, where there will be pushback from people that will say, well, the people who sell me alcohol at the store, not necessarily behind the bar, they didn't go to school but again, We're not saying we're
right.
not saying that's right.
Right.
We're actually saying that's probably not right.
That's right. Not right. That's right. Yeah.
That's not right.
That's
you know,
right.
again, I mentioned the prohibition thing. I'm happy prohibition is gone, but it could have been done better.
Right.
You know, we might not have had all of the cases of alcohol addiction that we have now if people knew a little bit more about the substance that they were consuming.
Right.
So, I mean, just going along those lines of research, you are a part, I mentioned this during your intro, the Cannabis Research Initiative.
That's right.
What the hell is that?
Well, so many fascinating stories. So in 2016, when the state of California, it was Proposition 64, it was put out to the voters, the same election as the presidential election in November 2016.
Okay.
The question was, it was called the Adult Use Marijuana Act. They used the word marijuana. And the question was put to the citizens of California, shall California now regulate and sell cannabis to adults to use for recreational purposes? So again, it was recreational legalization of cannabis. But the number two part of that, this was really a social justice proposition. It was meant to take away the misdemeanors and the felonies associated with cannabis possession. It was also meant to give minorities and communities of color an ability to get into the cannabis industry. So those were some other really great things attached to it. But the core of it was to say, hey, our state is going to allow and accept the cannabis industry as a regulated marketplace.
Okay.
So with that in mind, when I looked around the state, there was very few academic centers that were studying cannabis. There was UCSD had a medicinal cannabis research center looking at kind of laboratory-based animal sort of things about what does cannabis do to the brain. And there was a researcher at UCI, University of California, Irvine, that was also doing some work there. But that was it. So a number of us at UCLA Medical School thought, well, you know what? This would make sense that if we turn our attention with the power of UCLA and all the research that we do there to try and create our own dedicated cannabis research program. That's why we came up with the Cannabis Research Initiative, because prior to our group, there was no formal cannabis research program at UCLA. There were people who had done research in various labs, but nothing centralized and organized.
No one was together.
No one was together. So it came out through an idea that we were going to approach it from our department of psychiatry, the general principle to better understand how does cannabis impact the body, brain, and mind. How do we unlock the therapeutic potential of it while also reducing the potential harm from it? So that's why I came at it with the vision of I wanted to study cannabis addiction, cannabis use disorder, and develop treatments to help people who develop an addiction to it. Our partner and our other faculty members also wanted to look at, for instance, cannabis and its impact on pain. Could we use cannabis instead of opiates to treat pain? One of our other researchers wanted to look at effect on cannabis and sex differences, men versus women. You know, a woman smokes a joint. How is it different than when a man smokes a joint? And what does it do to their body? So suddenly we're getting all these very interesting questions about cannabis, and that's how we created this initiative. So it's a chance for us faculty to get together and talk about cannabis, to talk about the research priorities, and then to start putting research grants together. And that's really where the last 3 years we've been focused on getting some research funding. We have funding right now from NIH to study cannabis and its impact on sex differences and other things. And now we're looking at getting funding from private donors, but also from the state of California. Proposition 64 set aside $10 million a year from revenues generated by cannabis sales to go back to studying the impact of cannabis through research.
Using the sale of cannabis to fund the research on cannabis.
And that's an example of, I think, good science-based legislation, is that use the revenue from a product that has both a lot of really great potential, but also potential harms, and give it to researchers who can study that and come up with a better understanding of how to use this properly. So that's a short version of it, of how we came to be and how we came to study its impacts, both good and bad and neutral. I mean, I'm not pro or against cannabis per se. I'm just pro understanding cannabis and using it in a better and healthier way. Right. You know, I'm originally from Chicago, but I consider myself an Angelino now. I'm still a huge Chicago sports fan, and I'll never root for Angeles sports teams, but we'll get to that at a later point. But we're raising our kids here. Yeah. And that's important for me to leave an impact for our kids about how to use cannabis properly. So I think those are some of the stories of how we got built. Well,
the interesting thing about doing research for cannabis is that it is Schedule 1. Does it oh, by the way, well, you can if you feel comfortable doing it. Could you explain what the DEA schedule that I just referred to? What is that exactly?
So the DEA, again, is a drug enforcement agency, of course, headed up by our United States government that oversees all handling of, quote, controlled substances throughout the United States. Not only its inflow into this country, but also how we handle it as a country. Back during the Nixon years, they created something called a scheduled, where they would list various substances based on their determination of how abusive this substance is, how likely is this substance to cause addiction. The highest level of, quote, abuse liability was called Schedule 1. Mm-hmm. So if you got on this list, that meant that this substance had, quote, no medically accepted value.
Which is hilarious today.
Very hilarious. So what's on that list? Imagine who's on this guest list. Well, it's LSD, it's heroin, it's PCP, it's cannabis. What's on Schedule 2, Schedule 3, Schedule 4, Schedule 5? Well, Schedule 5 are like some sleeping pills, Ambien, Lunesta. Schedule 2 are like the heavier narcotics like Dilaudid and morphine, methadone. Schedule 3 are things like tranquilizers like Ativan, Valium, Xanax, benzodiazepines, and things like that. But what does it mean is, number one, as a doctor, if the substance is on a scheduled medication, I have to have a special license by the DEA to even prescribe it. You and I, we can't prescribe Schedule 1. They say that is so dangerous, no one can touch it, no one can prescribe it, and furthermore, no one can do research on it unless you have an actual license granted to us by the DEA. Okay. So that's why cannabis research for the last 100 years has fallen way behind our knowledge of opioids or alcohol or cocaine. And you say, wait a minute, cocaine's Schedule 1, isn't it? Yes and no. Cocaine is also used in a lot of medicines for anesthesia, so it's a little easier to use it actually in the lab.
This is, again, when we go back to we're just hijacking the system.
Exactly.
We're using all of these the same substances. Exactly. We're using them. It's just the way you use them and how you use them.
Way to use them, way to classify. And so the biggest barrier, so let's say you and I want to study cannabis at UCLA. And we have a lab now at UCLA where we can bring people in. We can administer cannabis in a controlled setting, just like your recording studio. Mm-hmm. And then we can measure scientifically the impact on their body, their brain functioning, how it makes them feel in a scientific way. But in order to do that research, we have to get a lot of clearance through a lot of different, federal and state level agencies. So it takes an extra almost 12 months to get the study going. So a lot of researchers are like, I can't deal with that kind of red tape, and they just decide not to do it. Or I can't deal with that kind of scrutiny. So even like storing the cannabis on campus at UCLA, you got to have you don't have to have armed guards, but you have to have secure systems and a lock, and you have to spend a lot of money to make sure that no one can steal the cannabis, because it's, again, Schedule 1, highly regulated substance. There's been talk in Congress over the last, since Obama was president, about taking cannabis off Schedule 1, which would then open it up so that researchers could do more research, faster research, and not have as many guidelines. But there's still resistance. Now, people have always said to me, where is this resistance coming from? And it comes from, again, in the halls of Washington. There's still enough people in positions of power that don't believe in cannabis as a therapeutic potentially for good. That still view it as marijuana. Yeah. They still view it as a way of, that's the way of Mexicans, or that's the way of communities of color.
Or people just want to get high.
Yeah, that's the way of stoners who are lazy. Quote, very fine people, if you want to say that. But so there's still a lot of stigma and dogma in the halls of Washington. But the tide's changing very quickly. And I think in the next 3 to 5 years, I think we will see Schedule 1 removal of cannabis. And the other thing there about too, if you remove it from Schedule 1, that means pharmaceutical companies, that means cannabis companies can now start their own research projects there as well. so much of research that comes from America, not just from NIH, but from private industry. Think about some of these antibodies and these vaccines that we're currently looking at for COVID. None of those are developed by the federal government. They're all generated by private industry. So the same thing, I think, will hold true for cannabis. When it becomes easier to do research, then you'll see a lot of the private sector doing very important research as well.
This is where I can see where regulation becomes a problem. There's a such thing as too much, because now we have barriers to you all just, going out there, coming up with different ideas, and it sort of stops researchers that would normally want to just dive right into it from this is too much. I can't.
Yeah, exactly.
UCLA is a powerhouse. It is. You have all of the Southern California schools. You have USC, UCLA. You guys have a lot of money. Not every school has the funding that you all do. So this is where regulation is good, but right. I can also see where too much regulation would be a problem.
And I think when people say, well, how come we don't know more? How come we don't know more about how cannabis works or to what it's good for or exact dosages? And I say, because we haven't done the research. We haven't been able to do the research. But the biggest part is we don't have as many researchers, a workforce. Think about a lot of young men and women coming out of PhD school or med schools who want to get into this world. And they're told, oh, you can't do cannabis research because you can't get funding. Or you can't do cannabis research because there are too many hoops. And if they don't have mentors, why would there be another generation behind us to do that? So that's part of the story of having a UCLA cannabis research program, is to attract young, eager researchers from all walks of life. History, politics, science, neuroscience, psychology, psychiatry, to be the next generation of researchers. As an example, I've never been, no, I shouldn't rephrase. I've been to a number of scientific conferences on cannabis. I've also been to a number of conferences on cannabis that are trade shows. The difference is night and day. The cannabis professional societies are scientists who use the rigorous scientific methods, who ask tough questions, who are not here to make money from cannabis. That's very different than when you go to a cannabis trade show,
right?
And they say, hey, here's our vape pen product, 100% pure, you're going to love it, 30% THC with a little bit of CBD kick. And I say, what's this good for? Oh, it's great for sleep. How do you know? Oh, because I tried it myself. Well, is that science? No, that's a sales job. And I think that's where, for people differentiating, how do I really know? That's the hardest thing. So you walk into a dispensary right now and you say, I'm just curious about cannabis. I just want something for anxiety or sleep or my back pain. And you ask the person behind the counter, can I have something for my back pain? And again, you don't ask the bartender, you don't ask the person at the Ralph's or the 7-Eleven, hey, what vodka is good for my sleep? That doesn't happen.
No. Yeah.
But that does happen inside dispensary, recreational dispensaries. Same thing. If you say to a bartender, hey, I want a cannabis that'll give me a 4-hour euphoria followed by a 6-hour reduction in my anxiety. What do you have for me? Oh, I got this product. No, they're just throwing darts at the board. So I keep going back to that because I want people in their mind's eye to think about where we are in 2020 with our knowledge of cannabis, our supposed knowledge of what it's actually in there and we don't really know, and what happens if we start ingesting this product for years. Again, we've only been legalized for 3 years. What happens after 20 years of use? So one of the things I always wonder is we didn't know about the opioid epidemic or crisis when we were in medical school. So I remember going to medical school, and you probably do as well. Pain is the 5th vital sign. Treat pain aggressively, otherwise, blah, blah, blah. No one foresaw any of this. And here we are.
That we will be a part of causing the...
Exactly. We would be the problem. So again, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, are we going to be talking with another follow-up podcast about a cannabis crisis that was created back in the old 2020? I certainly hope not. And that's where I hope discussions like this gets people informed and to speak up and do things right.
What I also worry... Hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. At this point in the conversation, we're going to take a short break. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Cube LA podcast.